Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Aamer Fattah. I'm the head of transformation at Investment Trends. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to share some of our learnings and experiences working with the great AWS team on security, and also some examples of how we've scaled and built innovation and growth with AWS. Now, I should grab the pointer. I was going to try to do it the old-fashioned way with sign language, but the pointer probably helps. All right, going to go on a bit of an adventure today, if you will. So we'll start by talking a bit about investment trends to help set the scene, who we are, what we do, to help kind of build context so you understand where we're coming from. A little bit about our technology journey. I won't spend too much time on that, but again, just to help set the scene. And then we'll take a deep dive into AWS Security Onramp and our own experiences implementing that and some of the benefits that we've achieved as a result of that. And then I'll touch a bit on AWS Fargate and high performance computing, again, as examples of how you can leverage the shared responsibility model to scale and improve your security and grow and innovate. Then I'll touch towards the end a bit about on the future and what we're keeping an eye on. So a bit of quantum and post-quantum cryptography. So if that's your thing, please stay around till the end. So that was kind of the plug to keep you in to the very end. All right, so about investment trends, who are we? We're a market research company specializing in financial services. We were established almost 20 years ago, Australian founded and based, but with global footprint. And we work closely with financial services companies in Australia and around the world. What we do is and what wakes us up in the morning, makes us go to work, is delivering through our data-driven insights and advanced statistical capabilities, insights to financial services that help improve, financial services providers that help improve the quality of and innovation in financial services products to consumers in Australia and around the world. We do this by through our research capabilities, how we conduct the research, and our advanced statistical techniques, including machine learning and analytics. Our research spans over 8 countries now. We're always expanding, so we're 9 at the moment. And our clients, again, include leading and all financial services of all sizes in Australia and globally, fintechs, superannuation funds, and the regulators as well. So we're a small to medium-sized company, depending on which definition you use, but we've got a really big footprint in financial services. A bit about our technology journey. So like many companies, we started out if you started years ago, on premises. And back in 2019, we started the cloud journey on AWS, working with an implementation partner to help us establish the architecture. And it was just initially your traditional lift and shift. And in recent years, we've been leveraging additional services and innovations from AWS to help us build security and also scalability and reliability as we grow. Which brings us to security. It's been great to hear a common theme from the different talks and panels today around how security is a shared responsibility. It isn't just something that sits with your security team or your technology team. It has a business-wide impact. And from the recent headlines going back to late last year, we can see it's not just a technology issue. There's impact in terms of customer trust and regulatory implications and real operational business implications, impact on your people as well to manage and deal with an incident. So it's great to hear and see that the conversation about security, not just being a technology or security team thing, but a broader business issue is gaining traction and momentum. And all of you here, probably preaching to the converted, you get that, but please continue spreading the word that it is a collective responsibility. On the topic of cybersecurity risk and incidents, again, this won't be news to many of you if you've been keeping an eye on the headlines of late. Threats have been increasing. The ACSC, there was a great presentation from them earlier in their latest annual report to the end of June last year. They reported that the cybercrime reports that they receive have increased by almost 13%. And these are just the reported cybercrimes. So there is underreporting, as in some of them don't get reported. So there is a tangible data to demonstrate that there is an increase in the threat, as well as all the headlines that we see almost on a daily basis. So that's a great segue into AWS Security Onramp. So if you're a business like us, or on the stage of your cloud transformation journey, where you're not sure what's a good starting point to assess your foundational security, AWS Security Onramp is a great starting point. This is where I'll touch a bit on the shared responsibility model for security. So the principle is that this is what we're guided by working with the AWS team on Onramp. Security off the cloud is the responsibility of AWS, depending on the services that you use. And then security in the cloud is the responsibility of us, the customers. And that changes depending on the compute services and other services that we use from AWS. And when I get to the Fargate example later on, I'll give you a practical example of how you can leverage this model to help shift the lever towards AWS taking on more of the heavy lifting around security, so you can free up your team and resources and capacity to innovate and grow and scale. Now, AWS Security Onramp is a little circle there. You can see, let's call it a circle of security and compliance and trust. And these are the 8 foundational security controls that are part of AWS Security Onramp. Like I said before, it's a great starting point if you haven't gone through this already, if you're looking for a refresh to assess the foundational security of your AWS accounts. It's a guided program. I'll get into how it works later on, but essentially those core 8 foundational security measures are around accurate account information, human access protection, programmatic access protection, for example, through the command line interface or consoles, secrets and credentials management, network access control, your patching processes, your public S3 buckets, and then detective controls and alarms. So it's quite comprehensive. And again, it's not overall intended to be an advanced program. This is a great starting point, and you go through a structured mechanism around these 8 controls to assess your own account and AWS account and posture. Like I mentioned, there's a couple of different approaches. So there's an automated approach where through AWS Security Hub in your AWS account, you set up, you develop or deploy it's called a custom insight for AWS Security Onramp, and then it goes through this discovery and assessment and recommendation process automatically, which is great if you're looking for a time saver, so you don't have capacity to go through it manually. And then there's a manual approach, which our team took, working with the AWS experts to go through the AWS Onramp structured questionnaire recommendation tool. So the way we did that was we set it up what's called a custom lens in our AWS architected tool, and then worked through a series of technical workshops, which are coming up on the next slide, supported by really great expertise from the AWS team to help guide our team who hadn't gone through this before along the journey and help us assess the different high risk and medium risk items, which I'll explain shortly, and then the mitigants and controls and remediation that we went through as well. As we went through the AWS Security Onramp workshops, again, we kept in mind the shared responsibility model for compliance and security, and in a systemic way went through the 8 foundational controls of that circle of security and compliance I showed you before. And the end result was that we enhanced our foundational security posture, plus a range of benefits, which I'll show you on the slide that's coming up. Now, in terms of the key outcomes of Onramp, as you assess those 8 different foundational security items, you will come across high risk items and medium risk items. To simplify it, high-risk items are architecture or operational choices that you make within your AWS environment that have the potential to result in a significant impact on your business. And then the medium risk items, or MRIs, are essentially similar definition, architecture, operational choices, but not as significant as the high-risk items. So it keeps it simple in terms of deciding what fits into which bucket. I'll give you an example of high-risk and medium-risk item for one of the foundational core items in OnRamp, and that's accurate account information. Unfortunately, I can't give you our actual items for obvious reasons, but a typical example would be the accurate account information in your AWS account. Obviously, important to make sure that the primary account holder's details are, I mean, say it's obvious, but sometimes it slips. Maybe someone has changed roles within the organization or moved on, and the primary account holder's details or name, contact details haven't been updated. Obviously, that's important because it prevents you from losing access to your account, so which is a big issue if you're running production workloads. Helps you authenticate if you've lost multi-factor authentication for some reason. And also importantly, the AWS team can contact you if they need to get in touch about an account-related issue, billing, or something urgent. And then the medium risk item dimension of account information is the secondary contact details and also setting up security questions in your account. So obviously still important to have a backup, but not as significant an impact as the primary account holder's details not being up to date. So it's just one example, and through OnRamp, you go in a structured fashion across all the 8 foundational security items, and you work through them to identify what are the high-risk items. It's just one example here. There's many more that you work through, and then there's recommendations on how you can remediate them or patch them or address them. So a quick summary of the benefits for us. These are the actual tangible benefits for us as a result of AWS OnRamp. We started out with the assessment with 5 high-risk items and 7 medium-risk items. So that's quite a few, and then working through the process supported by the great AWS experts, we ended up with 0 high-risk items, 4 medium-risk items. Again, as you assess these, some you might have existing controls or mitigants, so you don't necessarily need to remediate everything. But in our case, we remediated 3 of them, and the others we had really effective controls in place, so we're comfortable with those. And overall, you can tell just from the numbers, we improved our risk profile, our foundational risk posture, and importantly, our visibility of the risks in our account across these 8 dimensions. Another side benefit, which is great for our team as well, is working closely with the AWS team and their security specialists helped upskill our team as well in OnRamp and in our AWS environment in general. So that was another added benefit. What's next after OnRamp? There's a few innovations in areas that we've been exploring and continue to explore, have on our radar. So an AWS well-architected review. So if you haven't come across it, it's been mentioned earlier today. It's essentially doing a comprehensive review of how you're using and operationalizing and setting up and designing your architecture on AWS. We've gone through it ourselves a couple of times, and we're planning to do a refresh again because the environment changes. There's always new innovations coming from the AWS team. So what's next for us in terms of optimizing our security posture, but also innovating and scaling and growing with AWS. CloudWatch is a tool we're already using to CloudWatch tracks and allows you to configure alerts for specific metrics, including security alarms, which we've been using, and that's the automation piece. We are a small team. Many of you might be working with smaller businesses, and so capacity is always an issue, and any help in terms of automating that threat detection and monitoring piece is very valuable. And you can set up alarms, and then once those are triggered, you can react to them in real time. Amazon Guard Duty, we've heard about it earlier today. Again, a great innovation from AWS that is specific on threat detection, so real-time threat detection. Again, for a smaller team, that support in terms of continuous monitoring and automated detection and alerts is really valuable. And Guard Duty monitors your entire AWS environment and alerts you to any potential threats. And then pulling it all together is AWS Security Hub, which, as the name suggests, is a hub. It includes Guard Duty and security Onramp, and is really a place where you can develop insights and get insights into your environment. And there's some additional tools around security monitoring and compliance as well. So that's next on our plate in terms of our AWS journey to improve our security and scale and grow. Which brings us to Fargate. So remember when I mentioned before the shared responsibility model for security and compliance, and how you can shift the needle towards to free up your capacity to innovate and grow while ensuring that you've got security in place. That's security off the cloud with Fargate. So Fargate is a container as a service where you don't need to configure virtual machines or clusters of virtual machines. You can actually deploy your apps in containers that are serverless. And what that does, and I'll share with you a summary slide of the benefits that we experience. But what that does is that shifts the security in the cloud responsibility for you as a customer over to AWS Security off the cloud. So they're managing the patching, keeping an eye on updates for the containers, while your team and your time is focused on growth and innovating and scaling. So like I said, it's a serverless container as a service compute service. There's built-in monitoring integrations, which is really important. So through CloudWatch, you can set up alerts and monitors based on pre-configured metrics and events, which we're using to great value. There's also the added security through isolation by design. So when you're running your infrastructure on a container, it's isolated from other containers. So whereas if you're running on virtual machines, you might have multiple applications or infrastructure running where, if there's a breach of one, then everything else gets breached, whereas you've got a separation with Fargate. And another key benefit, especially if you're a smaller or scaling business, is you only pay as you grow. You configure the compute that you need. You don't over provision, and you can increase that as you scale and grow. So there's cost optimization benefits as well. So I've touched on some of these already. So there's a summary slide of our experience before and after we migrated to Fargate. So we were using EC2 before, and we migrated to containers on Fargate. And the key benefit around security is that leveraging that shared responsibility model, and AWS helping us by doing some more of the heavy lifting of security in the cloud and freeing us up from that patching and updating activity. That's very important, but now we've got our focus and resources on actually growing and developing new applications and features. With the servers as well, and the need for maintenance and monitoring and management in general, there's more complexity. Again, another benefit is we've reduced the operational complexity for our team. And I've touched on the monitoring also. So with containers through Fargate, you can integrate that with alarms and real-time monitoring through CloudWatch, for example, which we've been leveraging, whereas previously you'd need to apply, we needed to apply manual monitoring. Now, once we'd set up we're comfortable with the foundational security and helped free our resources up and improved our security posture through the migration to Fargate. That gave us really and set us up to start exploring innovative areas like high-performance computing on AWS. And this was born out of a real business problem. So a lot of companies today, not just us, would be when they're running computationally intensive machine learning models or jobs or statistical analyses or simulations, you still find many companies and businesses are running them on-premises devices, and there's a lot of limitations to that. The jobs tend to take hours, sometimes depending on what you're doing, and there's also limitations to how powerful the models or how accurate they are in terms of iterations that you can run. We'd been using on-premises for our advanced statistics and machine learning, and at one point, one of our more powerful computers had an outage, and we were speaking with the AWS team, and they said to us, well, have you thought about high performance computing? So it was born, the idea was born out of a real business problem, and then we worked with great support from the AWS team to develop a proof of concept around high performance computing for one of our machine learning models, and with great benefits that I'll share with you on the next slide. Essentially, with high performance computing, in our experience, it helped us accelerate innovation. It helps improve operational efficiency. You can essentially scale up the number of CPUs, GPUs, compute power that you need depending on your needs on demand when you need it. And you can optimize the performance of those models. Again, there's a lot of, as you start exploring this opportunity and the availability of essentially large numbers of CPUs and GPUs to run your computationally intensive workloads, you'll find that there's a lot of new areas that you can explore, like parallelism, for example, which helps you leverage multiple processors at the same time to even gain more speed. And this is all really enabled through fast networking as well, which is critical if you're running those data and analytically intensive jobs. So for us, some of the key benefits, again, before we had on-premises devices with a limited security in terms of we didn't have that real-time monitoring. It was manual mostly, whereas with having set up the foundation through AWS Security Onramp and Fargate and CloudWatch, and with the real-time detection and monitoring, that really gave us comfort that we had a good foundation to leverage high-performance computing. It was much slower on premises. So in that proof of concept case that I mentioned, for one of the jobs that we've been running, it would take something like 8 to 9 hours on an on-premises device, and we reduced that by 25 times. So that's essentially another way to look at it is you can run 25 jobs instead of one job in the same time. So really fantastic speed up or wall clock benefits if you're in that advanced statistics and machine learning space. On-premises devices for computationally intensive workloads aren't scalable if you want to, well, they are, but very expensive. You'd need to buy many really powerful computers with a lot of GPUs, whereas on AWS high performance computing, you can scale up depending on your needs, and you've got access to, in theory, hundreds, thousands of CPUs and GPUs through AWS on the cloud. The other key factor and element to consider is also the cost. So on-premises devices, especially the ones that are powerful, that can run these machine learning models and simulations, tend to be expensive because they have those, multiple CPUs and GPUs and chips. Whereas with AWS, you essentially pay for what you use by the millisecond. So very scalable, especially if you're a smaller business and growing. Which is a great segue into the future. So high performance computing, where does that go into? And one of the areas I've been passionate about and the team have been passionate about is quantum and the emerging developments and innovations in the quantum computing and information sciences field. So I'll touch briefly on that, but I'll start with the risk side before the opportunity. We will get to the opportunity, but I thought start with something a bit scary and then something a lot happier. So this is a quote from an AWS colleague highlighting that the National Institute of Standards and Technology is expected to release their first draft of the post-quantum cryptography industry standards actually this year. And the final version is due next year. And if you haven't been too close to the quantum space, there was a great panel actually sponsored by AWS at the Quantum Australia conference in late February this year, where a bunch of experts were talking about post-quantum cryptography and the emerging developments in this field. That was over an hour and a half. I'm going to try to condense it into 3 minutes and the key points that I think you'd find interesting. So about 30 years ago, a mathematician by the name of Peter Shor wrote a theoretical proof, a quantum algorithm. It's actually called Shor's algorithm, demonstrating that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer can hack and can factorize extremely large numbers. I'm talking really large numbers. In the time that would take, I love this description, the time that would take the most powerful supercomputer today, the age of the universe, to factor those numbers. So the gist of that is that quantum computers are really good at factorizing large numbers and the type of mathematical problem that is involved in hacking encryption, which is, and Shor's algorithm is a key quantum algorithm that can actually do that. What's happened since over the past 30 years is that quantum computers have actually been developed and exist, and they're increasingly getting more powerful. The panel that I mentioned before, a professor on it was asked, how far away are those powerful quantum computers? He said, it's a safe bet, probably 10 years from now, 10 to 20 years, maybe as soon as 10. So it's not really that far away. And the reason that NIST and AWS, who is a collaborator with NIST, are working on these post-cryptography standards is because there's going to be a lot of activity around retrofitting and updating our existing encryption. So this is all encryption that we use today. Public key encryption that we use to secure the internet, encryption that you use to secure connected network devices. All of that needs to be retrofitted, updated with these post-quantum cryptography algorithms and capabilities. So the encryption that we have today is described as quantum vulnerable, and the algorithms that are being developed and the standards being developed are quantum resistant, and we're transitioning into that quantum resistant future. You might think, 10, 20 years to go is really plenty of time for me to start thinking about this, but there was a report in the MIT Technology Review a couple of years ago that threat actors, including nation states, have already started. You might have heard of buy now, pay later. They've started what's called harvest now, decrypt later. So they're actually harvesting encrypted data on the understanding that in 10, 20 years, they'll have access to powerful quantum computers that can potentially decrypt that data. So the time is now to look at, if you're not already across it, to start looking at post-quantum cryptography and what it means to you. In a lot of cases, it's going to mean an update through AWS and patches and updates that are pushed to you, which is fine. But if you're working in the space, and especially if you have integrations with other companies, then one of the key areas that's coming up in terms of activity is that integration piece with different companies and being on the same standard. So an important area to be aware of. So that was a bit of the scary stuff and the risk. It's coming with the quantum, but there's a lot of good stuff with quantum as well. So AWS, actually, if you haven't come across it already, have a great compute service called Bracket. So essentially quantum computing on the cloud. Previously, if you wanted to explore or experiment or develop quantum computing or machine learning algorithms, you needed to buy your own quantum computer. It costs millions of dollars. You don't need to do that now. You can actually just set up within a few minutes your instance on AWS and have access to quantum computers on the cloud. And a lot of companies are taking advantage of that and starting to build experiments. There's quantum simulators as well, so that give you the potential outcomes of those powerful quantum computers are still years from now. There's a lot of companies across financial services, pharma, materials science, logistics, the military. The Australian Army is one of the leaders in this space. They're all developing experiments and models using these technologies. With AWS, you can get access to a quantum computer on the cloud, which is, I think, is fantastic to start those experiments exploring this area. Again, it's you can develop hybrid workloads. So a lot of companies are developing classical hybrid, classical quantum machine learning models and experimenting with those. You get priority access and, importantly, expert guidance and support from the AWS team. So that's one that I recommend exploring if you haven't already. So to sum up, we've covered quite a bit of ground today in the past half hour. Thank you for joining me on this short adventure. AWS Security Onramp is a great tool to assess your foundational security if you're looking for a good starting place or a place to review. Services like AWS Fargate, serverless compute services, are great if you want to free up your capacity and shift that needle in terms of shared responsibility where AWS help you with more of the heavy lifting around your patching and updates to servers, so you can free up your time to do more development and innovation and growth. And we've got a QR code, some of you have scanning it already, where you can access a self-serve on-ramp workshop, whatever you like. High performance computing, a great use case and application if you'd like to explore speeding up your machine learning and advanced statistical models. And in terms of future, there's a lot to look at. Post-quantum cryptography and quantum computing are what I'd suggest you explore next. Skill Builder is a fantastic tool for development. There's over 600 free online courses there. Our team have used it to great value. I highly recommend it. And finally, thank you for listening. I hope you found something interesting, useful today, and very grateful to the AWS team for the opportunity to present to you today. Thank you.